On March 3, 2011, the Jewish Chronicle announced the discovery of dozens of lead books from Jordan. It was later to emerge that the Jordanian authorities believed they had located the find spot from which the artifacts had been looted. Although a 2017 Jordan Times headline reported the DAJ chief declared the Jordan codices fakes, in fact the Director General in the article never says the lead books are fakes, only that they might be fakes, and that their authenticity has not yet been proven. Questions about their authenticity have been addressed elsewhere in clips produced by the Center. One pertinent question is whether the text on the lead books says anything meaningful. Early opinion was divided. On the one hand, the Jewish Chronicle report cited the Israel Antiquities authorities believe that whilst the book's lead was old, their texts were modern. The reason? The words appear to be a meaningless mixture of Hebrew and Greek letters. Separately, in March 2011, the Times Literary Supplement also reported Oxford classic scholar Peter Toneman's view that the artifacts were recent pseudo-Christian forgeries with no connection to Jewish mysticism, as suggested by contrast by the Jewish Chronicle report. On the other hand, the report also mentioned the more positive opinions of Oxford archaeometallurgist Peter Northover and of a chartered engineer and member of the Institution of Metallurgist Robert Feather. Based on Lemaire's analyses, Feather believed the books may contain references to Shimon bar Kokhba, military leader of the Second Jewish War against Rome in the 130s CE, and to Shimon bar Yochai, whom Jewish tradition links to the origins of Kabbalah. That might explain the lead book's cryptic Hebrew and Greek messages.
If one had to make an overall conclusion of the results from the Oxford Materials Testing Laboratory results and the text that we find in the lead codices, they all indicate a 2nd century CE dating for the material. Peter Northover, who did the metallurgical tests, and I was there with him helping on some of them, came to the conclusion that they were probably 2nd century CE, Roman period. He wasn't adamant about that. He said they could be Middle Ages, or they could even be fakes. So we have to take it in the round as to what. But when you see the connectivity of the actual writing on the lead books, and it certainly has a connectivity to the 2nd century CE with the imagery of the temple and Bar Kokhba and Bar Yochai, the whole complex fits together, and they complement the idea that it is 2nd century CE material that we're talking about.
Consider first the claim, reported in the Jewish Chronicle, that whilst the IAA believes the book's lead and corrosion are old, the texts were added later because they show a mixture of incompatible periods and styles. But such a mixture of periods and epigraphy styles is known in authentic cases. We read, for example, in E.S. Roberts and E. Gardner, an introduction to Greek epigraphy, Part 2, the inscription of Attica. In inscriptions of the imperial age, we find a variety and inconsistency of writing which makes it often impossible to date them approximately by the forms of the letters, and sometimes causes confusion with inscriptions of an earlier date, owing to conscious imitation. The Hadrianic Age is a time of revival and imitation, in epigraphy as in everything else. Consequently, we find imitation, usually inconsistent and eclectic in character, of all sorts of earlier forms of letters. We also find in this same period many new and fanciful forms, not to speak of other variations too numerous to mention, in which individual fancy ran riot. There is little to chronicle except a continual and chaotic use of all sorts of forms, earlier and later. It may be that in the Jordanian lead books we encounter a Hebraic parallel to the formally and temporally inconsistent and even fanciful elements of imperial and Hadrianic Greek epigraphy as described by Roberts and Gardner, whose description still holds true after more than a century.
Because so many of these artifacts have been tested by prestigious labs and been found consistent with antiquity, that forces me, when I look at the mixture of epigraphy, to say to myself, all right, what could be a possible explanation for this phenomenon? And personally, the best argument that I have come up with that would be consistent with the metallography tests would be that, well, perhaps these artifacts were made after the Bar Kokhba revolt, because that's the latest references that I can find in Jewish history is from the Bar Kokhba era, looking back to about the time of the Maccabees, because that's the earliest point I can find referred to on the codices as a reference to Antiochus, and the epigraphy of the Greek letters there matches the Antiochus IV Seleucid emperor coins. Right? So they seem to stretch from Antiochus Epiphanes to Bar Kokhba. Well, that's almost 3 centuries. And so what if these codices are looking back and reviewing Jewish history from Bar Kokhba, or slightly after Bar Kokhba, to the time of the Maccabees, right? And synthesizing the art and the epigraphy of those 3 centuries.
So what are the facts? In this clip, I want to show you that through careful study, scholars have successfully identified numerous portions of straightforward, meaningful text in the Jordanian metal books that make sense in the context of Jewish scripture, liturgy, and mysticism. Renowned epigrapher André Le Maire examined the lead books for metallurgist Robert Feather.
André Le Maire is professor at the Sorbonne University in Paris, and I've known him for many, many years. And he's an expert in artifacts, in ancient artifacts, and a specialist in ancient languages. And these were completely new to him, so his initial reaction was surprise and even amazement. But he was very cautious about any assessment of what they might be or what their significance might be. He took some of the imagery away with him and said he would contact me later with a considered evaluation. In one of the books, he could see Yod Shin Resh, which he read as Yisrael. The logos that you see on the lead books were also informative for him. He saw all sorts of things there that he connected with possibly the Bar Kokhba Second Temple period, 2nd century period AD. Bar Kokhba was a revolutionary who led a revolt against the Roman occupation around about 135 AD, I think. And he struck his own coins because there was an independent Israel at that time when they managed to oust the Romans for a period. And some of the coins that were struck in that period seem to have imagery which is reproduced in the codices. But he saw that, and I as well had studied them fairly closely and saw similar imagery indicative of a temple environment. You had things like structures of bricks, walls, ladders, menorah, which is a significant Jewish symbol, and what he believed were stars indicating either the Messiah or simply the elevation to the heaven. And he took those as being examples of a temple that may be trying to be reconstituted by this Bar Kokhba, who was hailed as the returning saviour.
Feather informs us that Le Maire's findings on the lead books were inconclusive, leaving open both possibilities of ancient authenticity and a pre-modern hoax.
He wrote a fairly extensive report, and he included some of the things we mentioned, but the end of it, his conclusions were, A, it's a highly significant material that could date to the Bar Kokhba 2nd century AD period, or alternatively, a fairly sophisticated forgery. He wouldn't commit himself, he wasn't sure. He didn't exactly put a date to the possible forging, but he also thought that they were not modern. That was something he concluded from the state of the corrosion and so on, which other people, of course, have concluded. He said, we've got to be open-minded about this. They may be the most significant pieces of metal inscriptions that we've ever discovered, and possibly the first ever examples of writing in the form of a codex.
In 2011, the Jewish Chronicle distorted Lemaire's findings in an article that was unfortunately subsequently quoted frequently online. The Jewish Chronicle claimed Lemaire concluded the lead books were apparently a case of sophisticated fakes, a statement Peter Toneman later transformed into obvious fakes in a 2011 Times Literary Supplement article. However, Lemaire's actual written report speaks of sophisticated fakes only as a possibility, and not as the only possibility. Further instances of straightforward text in the Jordanian Lead Books have been identified by Dr. Zinner, whose work in this area has been commended by the eminent Semitist Robert Gordon of the University of Cambridge, Charles Habel of Rutgers University, and John F.A. Sawyer of Durham University.
The work that Samuel Zinner has done just shows how deficient many so-called experts are in the actual first-hand material. One of the interesting things about these codexes is that they require, I think, a certain kind of expertise to be acquired before we can really judge them, and I think most people don't actually have that. When you find artifacts like this, not knowing where they're coming from really and how old they are and whatever, the first thing you have to do, I think, is to explore all the possibilities. And this is something that Samuel Zinner has actually done to the point where he actually knows more about it than many so-called experts, including Toneman, who clearly in this case knows far less about it than Samuel Zinner does.
Zinner has found that the Lead Books reflect Jewish history from the Maccabees to Bar Kokhba from a post-Bar Kokhba perspective. Coin images and texts were an integral part of ancient Jewish history and culture, and they have inspired much of the Lead Books' contents. Zinner has also demonstrated that the image seen here is not that of Jesus or Helios, as some have mistakenly claimed. The images of this face on the Lead Books' front and back covers have been damaged. But the same image is more clearly preserved on the inside pages. There we see an amphix holding the hair in place. This means the image on the front cover must be that of a woman. Thanks to the clearer inside images, we can now recognize the outlines of the amphix on the front and on the back cover as well. Jody Magnus has suggested that ancient Jews were happy to depict the sun god Helios in their synagogues, perhaps to allude to the angel Metatron. If that was the case, then it is just as likely that in this lead book they were happy to depict what could be called the Shekhinah, God's feminine presence, with the image of a Greek nymph. Zinner has documented how the Sabbath morning prayer service has influenced the lead books. He has also found that an interest in the sacred tetragrammaton and tetragrammaton permutations pervades the artifacts. And he has suggested that the presence in the lead books of an early 2nd century CE Nabatean Greek grave monument mentioning Abgar, identified in 2011 by Peter Toneman, could be evidence of Nabatean support for Bar Kokhba. Zinner has also explained that the Abgar inscription might have been adapted in the lead books for apotropaic purposes and may indicate that they are artifacts created for burial purposes. As Toneman has reported, the grave stela containing the Abgar inscription has been on display in a Jordan museum. Toneman inferred that, therefore, the copper codex must have been created by a forger who had seen and copied the inscription at the Jordan Museum. However, he overlooked another possibility, that already in ancient times, someone, such as an Abgar family member for example, could have copied the inscription onto a copper plate, that is, the copper codex, out of memorial and apotropaic motifs. The practice of copying down grave epitaphs goes back millennia, and in some cases such epitaphs even gave rise to actual cults. It was also believed copied epitaphs could ward off evil spirits. Such an apotropaic motive could explain the copper book's Greek inscription's peculiar use of both forward and reverse writing. This trait is a known feature of ancient grave amuletic or ritual texts. Some historians conclude a number of Nabateans joined the Bar Kokhba Jewish revolt against Rome in the 130s CE, just a few decades after when the Nabatean Greek Abgar inscription had been created. And the copper book's Alphas, without crossbars, which Toneman mistook as sure evidence of clumsy forgery, is in fact a trait attested for Alphas during the same era that the Nabatean Abgar Salaman monument was erected. Overall, Zinner's findings are consistent with Lemaire's identification of the lead book's contents as pertaining to Bar Kokhba. There is much we do not know about the lead books. What we do know is that their content pertains to ancient Jewish history from the Hasmoneans to Bar Kokhba.
What are they saying? Well, first of all, they're saying that they're not Babel. Second, they are giving us a context for the Jewish resistance to foreign domination, particularly Rome. I think these little books will prove to be a paradigm shift in our understanding of the late Second Temple period of Judaism, just as the Dead Sea Scrolls were 2 generations ago. Now, we can't have these wild statements like more important than the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's just silly nonsense. That's tabloid nonsense. And because this particular combination of text and images doesn't fit our known reconstruction of the period, doesn't mean to say that they have to be ignored. What we have to do is to modify our reconstruction of the times in order to accommodate this additional evidence.
What we can say at this point is that given the apotropaic-like features of the Jordanian book's Abgar inscription and the cryptic texture of the other messages, especially of tetragrammaton permutations, Peter Toneman was arguably premature not only in his portrayal in the TLS of the artifacts as pseudo-Christian, but also in his dismissal of any connection between the lead books and Jewish esotericism or mysticism, what the Jewish Chronicle described as a possible early example of Kabbalah.